Okay. Item number 95, Councilmember Kassar.
Move it.
Councilmember Kassar moves passage of item number 95. Councilmember Harper Madison seconds it. Any discussion? Councilmember Kassar.
I think we've laid out what's in the item. I had a few questions for whoever's appropriate, be that manager or chief or other staff. And manager, you mentioned earlier that some changes had been announced this week. I'm interested in hearing what is new that was announced that would potentially reduce police use of force or otherwise reform the issues that we heard about today. What was announced that is beyond current policy? I think what we're laying out here is largely I think are important changes, but I'm interested in hearing what was announced today that goes beyond what we have here and beyond current policy.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember, and I'll let the chief chime in as well. But I think knowing that these were on the table for council consideration to move in that direction, both the clarification on things that are already policy within the police department, but more importantly, those things that may not be clear, and we need to make sure that we are looking at each of the policies and procedures within the department to make those clarifications crystal clear for the department. And chokeholds was one example from today, but I'll turn it over to the chief if there's anything else. But I think more broadly, just knowing that these are the things that the community and more importantly the council wants us to move towards, we will be working very quickly to update our policies and procedures as a result. I don't know if the chief wanted to add anything.
Certainly. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'm not sure if my camera is working or not, but as the manager said, there are several policies that we've been looking at. Particularly, we spoke last week or shortly, maybe before, about the use of impact munitions and the policy changes that we've made in that area. Additionally, as we've looked at the 8 can't wait policies, we've worked to update what we have here, looking at each of those 8. We've talked about before that the strangle, as it's called in there, the chokehold or the stranglehold, that is something that we have never taught nor approved. However, it was never codified in policy, and so we've taken that extra step now of making sure that that is codified in policy, so that not only is it made aware through training, but that officers see that in policy and the community understands that. We've looked at the use of de-escalation, and we do believe that that's an area that we are compliant with the 8 can't wait. We've looked at, I don't want to read each one of these to you. We've got a memo that will be going out shortly. We do, I'm not sure if it's widely known, we do have a policy here on duty to intervene that specifically states that officers who observe another officer using inappropriate force shall intercede to prevent further harm. And so therefore, that is something that we have addressed. And our use of force continuum does appear to be compliant with what 8 can't wait asks for, and that's the dynamic response to resistance model. And so we're looking at all of those policies. And then additionally, I think some of the more transformational change that you will see in the department will come through the work that lies ahead. That will be the result of some of these audits that are underway right now, specifically some of the audits that you council directed regarding our training academy and upcoming cadet classes, but then reviews that we have also sought out as a result of the Tatum report, and in particular, a consultant that will begin coming in to do a review of the culture here at APD as well. So I think we have things that we've already implemented, and we've got a path forward that we're looking at now to address some of those longer standing issues.
But as far as immediate policy change on these issues, it sounds like it's primarily the chokehold, stranglehold thing being explicit, just like what we're voting on tonight. Is there anything else that is new on that front beyond what it is we're voting on tonight, beyond current policy?
The other one would be the restriction in the use of less lethal munitions in those crowd situations like we've discussed. So those are the ones that we've done to this point. And again, our policies are always under review. And as we look at the 8 can't wait, we are looking at those underlying policies as well. We had not updated, there's a website where you load your policies on, and we had not updated our policies, I don't believe, in several years. So our training commander right now is working to update that as well so that we can ensure that we are following those best practices to the best of our abilities.
I saw that there was an announcement about body cameras. Did something change on the body camera policy?
There's nothing changed, but I think what we were doing, we were highlighting the importance of body-worn cameras. If you're talking about the press conference earlier today, there's a group called Just America that has been very involved in the local demonstrations and reached out to us and asked if we would participate with them. So we've met with them to discuss policy issues and things that were important to them. And one of those was body-worn cameras. And so through discussions, it was important to highlight the fact that body cameras obviously are only as good as their use, and that we do have a policy and will enforce that going forward as we have, that if there were to be an officer that intentionally deactivated their body-worn camera during a critical incident, that would be subject to an indefinite suspension. And then on top of that, if we believe there was criminality in that would be reviewed by the district attorney's office.
It's good to know that has been standing policy, and good to broadcast that. Was it ever resolved? Because we've been so busy that I didn't hear from the manager or the chief. I haven't gotten to check in on. Was it ever resolved where the Office of Police Oversight had a disagreement with recent policy changes as it related to body-worn cameras? If I remember right, the change would have created the possibility where if somebody's camera was turned off 3 times, it still may not have resulted in formal written discipline. Was that resolved?
So we're still in discussions on that policy, but specific to that policy, we have different levels of body-worn camera violations, and that was for the most minor. We obviously allow our officers the opportunity to turn off their body cameras at certain points, such as taking a restroom break or something of that nature. So we do understand that there may be times when the officer forgets to activate that camera, versus the most egregious, I was just talking about that intentional act. So we have different levels of violations that we look at, but we are still in discussions with OPO on a few issues to include that one.
And we also had testimony earlier about people being concerned, and I understand they're concerned given what happened at the end of May, beginning of June, about the use of sonic weapons. LRAD, I think, is one of the acronyms. But it seems like there have been instances in other cities where those have been used against people in protests, and it's caused permanent damage to people. Is that, do we have policy, or do we have an intent not to use those military-grade acoustic weapons on protests?
So correctly, that is the intent, but we will firm up policy in that area. We do have long-range acoustical device equipment, but we use it solely for the purpose of a public address hailing system, typically on tactical callouts with the SWAT team where they're trying to make contact with the person inside the home, giving them commands, giving them direction. That's how it was used over the weekend during the protest, and that's how we have used it here. But we can absolutely firm up policy to state that that is the purpose of that piece of equipment.
For communication purposes.
Correct.
Understood. Mayor, I'm actually just going to write that sentence down. If we could lay mine on the table and just come back to it, I'll post it on the message board so everyone can see that.
Okay. Councilmember Flanagan.
I just want to ask the city manager and the chief to be sure to attend the Public Safety Committee meeting that we will be holding next week. Please make room in your schedules. Watch the message board for the final posting language. I have a number of questions that I have for you, Chief. Stuff that I've seen going on, stuff that I've seen on social media that has really caused me to scratch my head a little bit about what's been happening in the department that you run. So rather than drag my brain through it after this long day for all of us, I will save my questions for the committee meeting. just wanted to give you a heads up.
Certainly.
Councilmember Ellis.
I wanted to ask you, first of all, I think you said that you were in the middle of updating the policies online. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think during a press conference today, there was a declaration made that the policies were already online. Can you tell me if they are available for the public to read through right now, or if that is in process?
So a couple of different things. The Austin Police Department's policy manual is accessible online, and then we update it periodically with any policy updates that have taken place since the previous update. The policies that we're discussing right now, I am in the final steps of clarifying the language whenever we do a policy change to these pillar policies especially. We make sure that they are vetted through the city's legal department as well to make sure they're worded appropriately. So the policies that I'm talking about specific to the chokehold and the less lethal munitions, those were going through the final language. The officers have already been instructed, however, of the restrictions on their use. We're just formalizing the policy right now. Once we do that, that will then go into the next release of the policy manual online, but it would be immediately distributed out to the officers as well.
And can you tell me more about how the officers receive those updates? Because I remember when we decriminalized homelessness, that we got a lot of phone calls because there was a disconnect between where the laws had changed and what was being implemented on the ground. And that was something that happened about a year ago. People were paying attention, and it seems like we even had to dig to figure out how are people updated about the new policies, what type of training is provided to make sure they're being enforced, no matter who is implementing it or who is on the receiving end of that. And it seemed to be like it was possibly a PDF memo that went out that wasn't necessarily training.
It depends on the policy itself. So we do put out training bulletins regularly to the officers. And when officers show up for duty, especially our patrol officers, they go through a pre-shift briefing. And it's during those briefings where they'll get updates either on incidents occurring in their community, crime patterns in the community, or in the case you're bringing up, training bulletins that reflect either new policies or procedures. And then additionally, as those new policies are rolled out, they get the opportunity to go through training sessions on those, either in those show-ups. Their supervisor may give them a briefing. It depends on the complexity of the policy sometimes too, if it's just a simple modification versus a significant rewrite of a policy.
That could be helpful information for us as we receive questions to make sure that we can tell our constituents how that conversation is taking place and how there is confidence that these new rules are being implemented correctly. And then another point, I think it would be extremely helpful if our friends in the media who oftentimes report on the work that we're doing and that you're doing could understand this as well, because we have just seen sometimes where we change rules and it seems to kind of get lost in the conversation, or there's just a lot of confusion about when the policies are taking place, how people are being trained to implement them, and where the general public can go to find that information, because they will be our eyes and ears on the ground. And we want to make sure that everybody's understanding the expectations when we change ordinances.
Okay.
Okay, we'll lay 95 on the table for just a moment. And we'll go to 96. Did you have something before we did that, Councilmember Alter?
Yeah, I just wanted to give the chief a chance, and I apologize if this was embedded in the other questions, but I didn't hear the answer. There were some significant changes to 95 between Tuesday and now, and I just wanted to ask if there were any elements that gave you concern that we should be aware of before we vote tonight.
I understand the concerns that exist nationally and locally with policing, and I think that as a profession, both on that national and local level, we're looking at ways to ensure that we are doing our best. I do have concerns with some of the restrictions that are being posed, that they in fact will make things more dangerous in certain circumstances. In particular, I know that the use of tear gas is very controversial, but when we have an individual say a suspect from an armed robbery, an aggravated assault that has taken a hold up inside a home, and we end up in a SWAT call out, and we're trying to bring that very violent person into custody, the most dangerous thing you can ever do in that circumstance is send that SWAT team into the home to apprehend that individual, because that person will know the layout of that house better, most likely. They will have had opportunities to potentially booby trap or make a stronghold. And you're forcing a confrontation potentially that right now we actually successfully address regularly through the use of these chemical munitions that create an environment that that suspect no longer wants to stay in, and therefore we're able to get them to come out and surrender to us. I am greatly concerned that if there is an all-out prohibition, that will make our officers' jobs much more difficult in that circumstance.
Thank you. I don't know, Mr. Kassar, are you aware of those situations and when you changed the language here? I don't know whether I'm just hearing this for the first time, so I want to make sure that we are moving forward with they can't wait, but I also want to make sure that we are not inadvertently creating problems that we're not aware of in our desire to move forward.
Understood. Yeah, it's really important for us to think through and hear all the issues, and this issue was raised to us. I understand that we don't want anybody being put in an overtly dangerous situation. The real challenge is, given that tear gas has generally been banned as a weapon that we would use in military conflict, I just cannot square utilizing it in our own city, and that's what it comes down to for me. Primarily, the primary thrust of this was its use on protests, like we saw the weekend before last. Since I've laid this on the table, want to make sure that we follow procedure and maybe get a chance to go over to Natasha's item, and if we want to, because I'm finishing posting the LRAD item too, but we can keep talking about it. But generally, for me, as it all comes down to it, if this is banned essentially by the Geneva Convention and international conflict, hard for me to square why we would continue its use in our own city, even in exceptional circumstances. So I would be interested in what other methods we have of safely getting somebody out of a house without resorting to chemical agents that have generally been frowned upon for a really long time, even in warfare.
And Councilmember Alter, if I may, I have another issue as well with the concern with the 1033 program, where we get equipment that is donated through the military. It is unfortunate that we live in a day and age when people choose to attack us in some of our most vulnerable places. And we don't have to look too far back to when schools were in session around this country prior to the COVID outbreak, that we were seeing school shooters. We were seeing mass shooting events in public spaces, churches, movie theaters, malls. And I absolutely understand the intent of a police department that is community focused and community centered and building on those relationships, but we also have to have that maintain that ability to keep our community safe should we come under that type of attack. And that's why we need to have the equipment and the training that will allow us to perform in those circumstances, so that if we ever find ourselves under such a horrible set of circumstances, we would be able to perform and we would have the equipment to perform. One of the department's helicopters also comes from the 1033 program as well. So if we start looking at a process to return everything that we've received, I think there's probably some discussions that should take place on that before it is just an all-out ban or decision. And then lastly, I know I say lastly, I might think of something else, and if so, I'll speak, but the use of those impact munitions, they still absolutely have a place in policing. I understand, and obviously we learned a lot a few weekends ago that we have not seen before, but I do believe that there is still an appropriate use for that tool because it allows us to engage with a suspect from a distance that we really don't have any other tool that would allow for. So I think those are probably my main concerns at this point.
And Mayor, for clarity on those two, on equipment that has been labeled, that comes from the federal government through that program or has been labeled military grade, this expresses our intent to try to reduce the militarization of departments within the city, but allows for us to make decisions on council. You know, if we want certain kinds of vests, that we could approve those. If we need certain kinds of equipment that goes into the air, we could approve that, while determining that there are other things that we do not need. And so there's clear language here that says, you know, we want to reduce it to the extent that is possible and the extent that makes sense. As it relates to impact munitions, to be clear, this isn't a ban on impact munitions. It is a restriction on impact munitions, saying we shouldn't be shooting those things at people just expressing their First Amendment right, nor should we be utilizing them against folks that aren't posing a threat to anyone. And so that's the intent, and I think that's the language. But willing to see if there's language that is unclear on those fronts.
You know, with respect to both of these, I hear the chief. I think that the intent and what we're trying to do, what I understand the intent of your resolution is to make the general rule that there are things that we're not using. And that becomes then the rule that we're adopting. If we were going to open up and allow some of these uses, I would much rather the chief have to come back to us and say, this is a narrow exception that I think should be applied to that general rule. And certainly I'd invite the chief or the manager to do that if they thought that was an appropriate thing to do. But I'm comfortable adopting the general rules that are laid out in this resolution, so that the exception and the burden is on having to justify the exception to that general rule, together with that invitation if it's appropriate. Further discussion, Councilmember Alter.
Thank you. I believe that it does read on line 56 that it's the stated policy to reduce it to the greatest extent possible. So I think that one could have a reasonable conversation about the helicopter situation. I did want to ask Chief Manley about if we have examples of where the military equipment was actually used to save citizens here in Austin. I understand the hypothetical you shared.
As far as using it to save citizens, I would go back to, since it's probably where we use the largest amount, the military type equipment, although we didn't get it from the military, things like our Bearcat tactical vehicles that we use to handle some of these tactical situations. They allow us to afford our officers protection while they're engaged in these very dangerous sets of circumstances. And so I think that is one example. In the past, we've received pieces of equipment that have helped protect officers, whether they be ballistic helmets or other surplus items from the military. We've just found it to be a very good source for equipment that we do need at times in the department.
Councilmember Kassar, am I reading it right, though, that there, as we've discussed, that there's the opportunity to present that you need to keep it for a particular reason? It's having the discussions for specific equipment. I don't have any way to evaluate specific equipment here tonight.
Exactly, and that's the purpose. If we recognize that we have militarized police departments across the country, we recognize that there's been an increase in military equipment within our own city and many others, then we should come up with and if we think that's not a good thing, then we should come up with a path of what is it that we should be doing without. Because of course, in every case, when a council or the department brings equipment in, it's because it's with good intentions, thinking that there are things that will make us more safe. But as we found, some of the things that we thought would make us more safe have in fact not turned out that way. And so this is really for us to reevaluate that, for us to see what it is that we can dispose of, and to create a requirement that if we are purchasing something new or are intending on getting new equipment, that we should have a conversation about it. So Councilmember Alter, I think your read on that is I would say that your read on that is my intent.
Thank you for the,
Okay? Do you have the amendment yet, or should we still lay this on the table?
The amendment has been on the message board, but I would, of course, want to give folks time to read it, so I'm okay with it being on the table when that's coming back.
You want to lay out what your amendment is?
It is what I just discussed here with the chief. It's at the bottom of the thread on these items, and I can read it out loud to you.
Okay?
It adds that the use of acoustic devices that can function as weapons, such as long-range acoustic devices or sound cannons, shall only be used for communication purposes at a safe decibel level, and use of it as a sonic weapon is prohibited.
Anybody need any more time with that? The amendment's been offered. Is there any objection to that amendment being added? Hearing none, the amendment's added. That gets us then to item number 95. Ready to take a vote? Those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed?